The Entrepreneur's Library, episode 173.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library, the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book that will enable you to grow personally and professionally. Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Thank you for joining us on the EL. Today we have Rob Jean de Jong, author of Anticipate, The Art of Leading by Looking Ahead. Welcome, Rob, and thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
Thank you very much for having me.
Before we take a deep dive into your book, Anticipate, will you take just a moment to introduce yourself? Tell us just a little bit about you personally.
Sure. So my name is Rob Jean de Jong. That's a very Dutch name, as you can hear. Feel free to call me Rob, by the way, if that's easier for you, I suppose.
Okay.
Sometimes Americans turn it into RJ. I'm not always keen on that. But I'm based in the Netherlands. I'm father of twins, two little 10-year-old boys, to whom I actually also am their soccer coach. So I do a lot of work in the field of leadership and putting leadership into practice with some 10-year-olds. That's a very different experience. Professionally, what I do are two things, really. I work a lot with leadership teams in trying to get them to engage with their strategic agenda, which really means dealing with their strategic topics, but very often also around a range of leadership themes about teamwork and things like that. I personally, I'm very enthusiastic about strategic topics from a human and psychological dimension. So I'm often labeled as a behavioral strategist. The second thing that I do is I actually teach about these subjects. So I'm involved in various executive education programs, both in companies as well as for various business schools. I'm associated with the Wharton Business School in Philadelphia. I do some work for the Thunderbird School of Global Management in Arizona and a couple of business schools here on this side of the ocean.
Excellent. So, Rob, first off, thank you for sharing that. And now let's jump right into your book, Anticipate, The Art of Leading by Looking Ahead, which was not that long ago, actually made available January 5th of 2015. And Rob, we're going to move quickly, but our whole goal here today is to help that future reader, the listener today, get a great idea of what they can expect to get out of your book. So we're gonna cover the top questions that they have. And the first one is, what was the inspiration behind writing Anticipate?
Well, my inspiration comes from about, I guess, 7 or 8 years ago. I was doing a lot of work in the field of leadership, and at some point I asked an audience, the question, what's the one word that you find in every definition of leadership? And immediately they fired back at me, vision. So I repeated the question several times, and in subsequent sessions, and I always find that very quickly people think of vision as a very important, vital quality of a leader. So typically, then what I did, I gave them a second question, and I said to them, okay, great, you are all leaders. So who of you has a vision? And then I noticed that nobody raised their hand. So I kind of got inspired by thinking, how can it be that something that we all consider to be so vital in leadership and such an important thing to have as a leader, why is it that in practice we struggle so much, or that we kind of consider it something that we we'll get to when we have time, but right now we've got more important things to do. So that kind of fascinated me, and that's basically what inspired me to look into this subject. And and I guess my discoveries over the 8 years of working with hundreds of leaders and progressing my thinking in terms of how can you make that topic applicable for people in reality, in the practice, is laid out in the book.
So, Rob, every day great books come out that are geared towards entrepreneurs. And so that's why this next question is really important, to give you a chance to differentiate. So what makes your book different from others regarding the same or similar topic?
Well, that's a very good question, because having done my research, obviously, at the very beginning and going into this topic, I noticed that all the leadership gurus, Bennis and Zelaznik and Kotter and what have you, they all put vision as one of the key characteristics of great leaders. And at the same time, that's kind of where they leave it. So we all note that it's really important, but you find hardly any book that tells you how are you now going. Now you're given that leadership role. Now you're put into that position. How do you now go about developing your vision? How do you grow that capacity, your visionary capacity, on an ongoing basis? It's not like you wake up on a Sunday morning and you have a vision. It's something that you need to develop, that you need to, you need to sharpen as time progresses. The future doesn't stand still, so you need to be continuously working on that side of your leadership ideas. And I very often say, you find many books we all think living a healthy life is very important, and you find thousands of books on how to live a healthy life. And in leadership, we all find vision very important, and you really will not find any book that tells you about how do you develop your vision. There are some random loose ends that people put forward, but I've tried to, maybe somewhat presumptuously would say I kind of felt I filled a gap in management theory by zooming in on how do you now do that in a practical form? How do you go about growing your visionary capacity in real life?
So, Rob, how did you design the book to be read, or how do you want the reader to engage? Is this a book that they can jump in and out as needed, or did you really design it to be read from front to back?
Well, it's more the former. I mean, in developing the book, I was going back and forth a little bit between, on the one hand, sharing some, let's say, more foundational academic concepts, but knowing that I'll be writing for an audience who are largely practical, I figured that wasn't the way forward. And at the same time, I didn't just want to in a shallow way write a how-to book. So I kind of found the middle way. I think there's many things in there that are eye-openers, that are integrations of multiple disciplines, and people can sit back and read that and reflect and, hopefully also learn or at least get engaged by that. But, throughout the book, there are 25 practices are scattered through the book, and they're very practical ways of making some of the things I talk about, make it practical. They'll direct you to a website, and you actually can get going. So it's really both sides, some academic foundation, not too heavy, but at least some gravitas under what I'm talking about. And at the same time, very practical ideas on how you do that in real life.
Perfect. So, Rob, now that we know a little bit of the background, the purpose behind the book, let's really take a deep dive into the content itself. So we take the next 5 to 8 minutes and really let our future reader know exactly what they can get out of your book.
Sure. Well, let me break it down into the different categories that I looked at. So the first area that I kind of broke it down into 4 areas. The first area is your visionary content. How do you go about creating ideas, creating visionary, let's say, ideas that your vision is made out of? Now, if we go into the past, we can get our ideas from facts and figures. If we go into the future, we'll have to untap our imagination. We got to step into our imagination. So that's the first area that we deal with. The second area is your visionary development. How do you go about growing that capacity? What are actually the developmental axes for growing your visionary side? When you want to grow your game of tennis, we know that if you practice your forehand and your backhand and your serve, you can play a very decent game of tennis, and if you work on that, you'll become better and better. You might not be the next Roger Federer, but at least you'll become better at playing your tennis game. But in vision, we haven't really brought that down to manageable skills. So I propose in the second part, a developmental framework that really consists of 2 different dimensions. One is your ability to see things early. So your ability to early on identify the changes at the horizon, what's going to be different in the next couple of years, and how can you, among the tremendous amount of information that hits us on a daily basis, how can you filter out the important factors that you should keep your eye on, sort of filter the signal from the noise. The other developmental axis there is what we call connecting the dots. How do you turn that, in a responsible way, put that all together into a big picture story, into an integrated, coherent story that's well developed in such a way that it actually doesn't set you up for tunnel vision, because that's the downside of a powerful vision. It can equally derail you. So we kind of work, in terms of yourself, in terms of skilling yourself, in terms of improving yourself on the vision in your visionary game. I provide 2 developmental axes, and in that same category, which really is the bulk of the book, to be honest, there is also a part on how do you do that practically. So what are the practices that you must master in order to develop those two axes? I introduce a very novel technique called future priming, which is really all about sharpening that first dimension, your ability to see things early. And I talk about the importance of envisioning multiple futures as you're developing your big picture through techniques such as scenario planning, and there are some other techniques that can help you take a broad perspective on what the future might bring, rather than very dogmatically zoom in on just one future that you have in mind, or that's the most favorable one for you. So that's the second part of the book. First part was, how do you tap into your imagination? What are you up against, and how can you unlock your imagination? Really, I provide some practices there, how you can do that. Second part is, how do you develop your visionary side? What are the developmental axes to work on, and what are some practical ways of doing that? The third area is really about yourself. So how, what's the productive mindset? What are the productive behaviors? What's the attitude that you must master, that you must reflect on in order to make this work? So you can imagine, if you're if you're not very curious, if you're not very willing to listen to others, if you're not very open-minded, if you're quite dogmatic, if you're not really open to other ideas, then it's going to be really hard to come up with a powerful vision. So there are things that you need to reflect on in terms of what builds my capability of doing this from a behavioral and mindset point of view. Equally, in that same category, as you're kind of reflecting on yourself and on your, growing your self-awareness about your behaviors, it is equally very important to understand what is it that you stand for as a leader. So what is it that you truly believe in? Visions typically fall flat when they are unauthentic. So authenticity really means, also authenticity of your vision really means that your audience, your listeners, you're typically in business context, your team members or people that see you as the leader, actually believe what you're saying, so that it is credible coming from you, which bounces a question back at you to be quite clear on what is it exactly that is authentic about myself, and how do I substantiate that through my behaviors in real life. So that's the third area, and then we bring it all together in the fourth area, in the fourth category, and that's also the last chapter of the book. All this stuff is broken out over 8 different chapters, sorry. But the 8th chapter is about, you can do all these things well, you can have great, very well tap into your imagination, you can actually do these developmental axes very well, you can be very self-reflective, but if you're not good at communicating your vision, if you're not very good in verbalizing it, it's still not going to work for you. So in the last chapter, we look at what does it require in order to make your vision fly as you communicate about it. And for that, I propose something that the Greek philosopher Aristotle already discovered, 2,500 years ago, is that in order for a vision to become powerful, you got to look at 3 different dimensions. The first is what we call logos, which is all about sense making. Obviously, your vision needs to make sense. If people don't get it, or if it's not aligned with what we more or less can expect or can be seeing going forward in terms of credible trends and things like that. Obviously, that people are not going to buy into that, so that's important. But that's usually the part that we've got well covered. Our analytical capabilities and our brainy part of our vision is usually well equipped. We're well equipped to do that. The second part of that, of making it powerful, is about pathos. That means people also need to be emotionally engaged. People need to actually feel something as they listen to you. So that means that your vision needs to stir up their emotions. That can be either because it's unconventional, it can be because it's connected to a noble cause, it can be both ways, but somehow it needs to have more depth to it, and it needs to resonate with people's hearts rather than just with their heads. And then there's the third part, which I already alluded to before. All this really rests on the behavioral integrity of the speaker. So in other words, if you don't act accordingly, if you don't, practice what you preach, then it's still all going to fall flat, and it's going to be considered hollow phrases as you speak about it. So it also requires that you make yourself an integral part of your vision, which the way of doing that in terms of communicating about it is using the power of what we call the power of anecdotes. So a powerful anecdote about something that happened in your life that tells us that tells us something about what you stand for, what you believe in, and what you truly care about is a great way of making your vision much more authentic than purely going through the head. So that's the deep dive, I guess.
That's perfect. And now we're going to ask you to kind of finish that off by giving us something. A question that I think is fairly difficult, but it's if the reader could only take away one concept, principle, or action item out of your entire book and everything that you just laid out in the last 5 to 8 minutes, what would you want that to be?
As you can see, I've covered quite some terrain, and it's very multidisciplinary. So there are lots of different thoughts in there, and it's also the feedback that I get from a lot of people is there like 1,000 ideas are in there. But I guess the core tag would probably be that vision is not something that you're born with or not, or it's not something that you have it or you don't. It's something you can develop within realistic terms. I always say it's a developmental concept, but just when you start to, just as when you start to learn how to play tennis, you're not expected to be the next Roger Federer. So you shouldn't have the same expectations when you start working on your visionary side. You will not be the next Steve Jobs. Now, I don't want to discourage anybody, but chances are that you won't, right? At the same time, it doesn't mean that the concept is not relevant for you. It's equally relevant, even if you're not one of the larger-than-life leaders. It's equally relevant because there are people looking at you who consider you their leader, and they'd like to be inspired with the story that you bring to them. And how you develop that story in a powerful way is really what the whole book is about. So I guess that will probably be the core idea is that it's a developmental concept, and you can start working on that.
Excellent. And do you have a favorite quote from your book? And we take just a second to explain what it means to you.
Yeah, I start. It's as a common practice. I start every chapter with a quote, and I'm very quickly going through my head which ones really stand out. I've chosen them all because I like them. One that really stands out is by Ellen Langer. I quote her actually saying, "Everything is the same until it is not," and I like that idea. I mean, we very often just motor on and trying to, we think tomorrow will be more or less the same as today, which it probably is on a day-to-day basis. But over a somewhat longer period of 1 or 2 or 3 years, we can see how quickly the future changes. So I think her quote really resonates with me. It says, it's the risk factor of working with the future. Everything is the same until it is not. And obviously what we're trying to do is make ourselves prepare and anticipate for what might be ahead of us so that we early on can take actions to make use of that change or to prevent damage or whatever it is that you're aiming for with your vision.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Rob. And this last question is, obviously, as a book-centric podcast, we have to ask for a recommendation. And we love to grow our list as much as we sometimes hate to grow our list of books that we need to read, but it's also just something about adding another arrow to the quiver. So if there's only one book you could recommend based on the way that it's impacted your life, maybe created a paradigm shift or a lifestyle shift, what book would you suggest?
Well, I didn't expect that question. Otherwise, I would have given you 2 different dimensions on that, because I'm going to follow through on what I just said about the work of Ellen Langer. Ellen Langer is a psychologist from Harvard. She's a professor of psychology at Harvard, and she's written for the past 30 years around the concept of mindfulness. And in fact, her book called the book I'm referring to is actually called Mindfulness. Now, this is not the Buddhist mindfulness that we're talking. We hear a lot about today about being quite in the moment. She talks about mindful leadership behavior, and she kind of offsets it against mindless behavior. And in the process of understanding what is mindful behavior, what does it require to notice things around you, she talks about mindfulness, and she brings it down to 3 areas, which is curiosity, open-mindedness, and being non-dogmatic. And you might have heard me use those words earlier on in the interview, because I've integrated those words into how do you build your vision. And I think having been exposed to her work a couple of years ago was a tremendous stepping stone in my own thinking about this subject.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that recommendation as well. So, Rob, before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listener to get more information on you and also your book, Anticipate?
Great. Yeah, there is obviously a website in my name. It's robjandejong.com. You can also Google me, find me on YouTube. There is a great book trailer out. I'm proud to say it's one of these artistically designed book trailers. So if you type in YouTube, anticipate the art of leading by looking ahead, undoubtedly you'll find it. And there's more stuff about me on YouTube. So I think that's probably the best resources to go with for those people interested to learn more about this.
Perfect. Well, Rob, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your book with us.
Thank you very much, Wade, for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks again for listening in today. If you'd like more information on Rob or his book, Anticipate, check out the show notes at the elpodcast.com. And if you'd like an opportunity to win this book, also visit the elpodcast.com and become a VIP.
Looking for your next book idea? Head over to the elpodcast.com, where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs, with you for free. That's the elpodcast.com. Till the next time, keep it on the EL.